Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now today we're going to be gaming from this. This is a USB Type-C drive. Now I can't really think of a real world scenario where you may want to run your games from a USB stick. Maybe you've run out of storage, you want to play that new title and you don't have any space left on your PC until your new SSD arrives. Maybe you want to just transfer a game from one system to another. Okay, so there are a couple of reasons I can think of. I tried this about 7 years ago now. Drives are faster these days, but games are also a lot more demanding, and I couldn't help but wonder just how well things would run. But let's get into it. First we'll check out the specs of this drive. Here are the results from Crystal Disk Mark. I'm not going to lie to you, these numbers don't mean all that much to me, but what I don't like the look of is that 0.01 figure at the end there. I'm going to be comparing the USB drive results to the SATA SSD today as opposed to the NVMe M.2 SSD, so the result on the very left and the result on the very right. I'll install a few games, check out the gameplay, and then check out the loading time. So let's start with Starfield first of all. Actually, the first thing to do was transfer some games to the USB drive. This is a 256 drive, so I couldn't do them all at the same time. It was quite a painful experience. The size of the game, of course, affected the time it took to transfer from my C drive to the USB drive. Starfield took ages. I went out, walked the dog, and came back and it was still transferring over. But in terms of actual gameplay, nothing really too bad. I did notice the occasional stutter here and there, micro stutter I guess you could call it. You can probably pick it up on the frame time graph, but in all honesty, no issues. We'll get onto loading times a little later on, but I tested a few different areas. There were no sound delays either with Starfield like we saw when we tested an old HDD a while ago. So things seem to be running okay here. You might remember actually that when we tested an old HDD, which are obviously a lot slower and doesn't really pair well with Starfield, there were audio delays. When we'd fire the weapon, things like that, the actual noise would come a long time after the initial firing. There was a little bit of a bullet delay here on occasion, but the sound was still in sync, the same as when talking to NPCs, so nothing too out of the ordinary here. The clouds also loaded in as they should whenever I landed the spaceship, so you know, it's running fine on the USB drive here, apart from the odd micro stutter, which I didn't notice during regular gameplay on my main drive. CS2 next. Now this did freeze a little bit when we started up. I thought it wasn't going to load, but it did move past this initial splash screen. The thing is, it then froze at the main menu after selecting full screen. It completely jammed up. I couldn't do anything. I had to alt tab out of the game, close it from within Steam, and then open the game up again. I wasn't sure if this one was going to work, but as you'll see in a minute, it did. Now with CS2 gameplay, no issues at all. It was really smooth. I couldn't actually tell a difference between this and my hard drive, my SSD, my SATA SSD. I mean, my performance was just as bad as well in terms of me trying to wipe out some enemy players. Still came bottom of the leaderboard, almost. But yeah, I mean, no problems here running from the USB-C drive. So CS2, pretty successful. The same can be said with Spider-Man actually. I was expecting worse here because it's quite a fast moving game, you know, you're swinging through the city quite rapidly. I was expecting some major popping, a few slowdowns and stutters, but again nothing apart from the initial transferring of the game to the USB drive, which did take quite a while. This is only 60 gigs or so, I want to say, so not as long as some of the bigger AAA releases like Starfield, but it still took long enough, put it that way. Performance was decent, as you can see here on my i5 and 4060 Ti system. To tell you the truth, the i5 is holding the 4060 Ti back a little bit in this case, especially at 1080p, but that's not the point of today's video, of course. As you can see here, no texture issues, no assets loading in late, anything like that. It will depend on the game, I guess, but so far so good. It's been a pretty decent experience on the old USB, or the new USB flash drive. Baldur's Gate 3 up next. This did take a little while longer loading. It actually froze here, as you can see. It said not responding, but I chose to wait and then it decided to unfreeze. We'll get onto loading times a little later on, as I mentioned, but this was just a little blip, and as you can see, it fired up after this. I loaded my latest save game, which was basically into the city here. I was expecting a lot worse. I did see a couple of NPCs pop in late, that was all. Now, This actually has a slow HDD mode, but I left it disabled. I didn't enable it here. I think this is best suited to really old HDDs. On this storage, I mean, it's absolutely fine. We don't need to enable it, in my opinion, for the sake of a couple of NPCs popping in a little late. That could happen on my regular SSD anyway. I've just never been looking out for it before, I suppose. Yeah, Baldur's Gate 3, even in and around the city, is running fine here. To finalise then, we have Cyberpunk 2077. Again, this one with ultra settings here ran absolutely fine. Again, the i5 is holding the 4060 Ti back in some instances. There were no major stutters or frame dips or drops here. In fact, the only game where I saw frame dips or micro stutters really was Starfield. The rest of them have run absolutely fine thus far. This is the final game I tested today, and after this we'll get on to a couple of loading times just so you can see the differences. I then got into a little bit of trouble with a few other NPCs here, seeing if things would slow down a bit, but again, no problems. So maybe if you want to keep a few games on a USB-C drive, you could do so without worrying too much. An old USB 2 drive is probably going to cause you a few more issues, of course, but with these modern drives it seems like most of the time things are fine. But let's look at loading times now. I'll touch on this briefly because I imagine you know what to expect here, but Starfield, 43 seconds to load on the USB drive, and on the SSD, my standard SATA SSD, the slower of the two SSD drives I use, 21 seconds, so it was almost cut in half here, the time it took to load. I then looked at the Spider-Man loading time. This was actually the same, 8 seconds for both, which was unexpected, but it loaded just as fast on the USB stick as it did on the SATA SSD, so that was nice. Baldur's Gate 3 takes quite a long while to load anyway, 1 minute and 1 second on my SATA SSD, and on the USB drive 1 minute 26, so 25 seconds slower. That is definitely a noticeable decrease in loading times, of course, but when it's taking over a minute anyway, it's really not that bothersome. Cyberpunk 2077, on the other hand, loads quite quickly. It only took 17 seconds on the USB stick, and it took 8 seconds on the SSD. So again, half the load time, but it's not a major wait at all, and that is going to be the end of it. To be fair, I mean, gaming on a USB stick is certainly possible these days, a modern drive. I just wanted to see how it would all work out because I've been curious about this for a while, probably since my new drive arrived, because I tested this a few years ago, like I said, with an old USB stick, and it didn't go as well as it went here. But yeah, I think I may have answered a question perhaps no one was asking, but I hope you enjoyed this video nonetheless. Thanks for watching. I should also mention that an SSD of the same capacity is going to be cheaper too. In most cases it is here, so I don't think, I'll buy a USB drive instead of an SSD. But I guess it depends on where you live. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.